Welcome, Major General Veary, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you and good evening.
Now, how widespread is the problem of drugs and gangsterism in the Western Cape?
I think historically, if one goes back, if you hear terms like 28 and 26 gangs, these gangs exist since the late 1890s and in the early 1920s to 1930s in the Western Cape. As for all the street gangs that are fighting here now, the fancy boys, hard livings, 28s, 26s, their existence, for example, on the street goes well back into the late 70s and the 80s. So if one is talking about the prevalence of this threat, it predates, it's almost as old as some of the townships that existed after the Group Areas Act dispersed people across the Cape Flats.
Now, what would you say, going back to the fact that after we got democracy 20 years later, we still have the scourge of gangs and the drugs issue? Back then, you may say it was a matter of survival. What is the reason? What is the reasoning for it today? Why is it so rampant?
I think one of the interesting observations is, despite the gaining of post-1994, the gains that have been made, there were two significant changes in policing's approach, I think, that is important. One is the advent of the Prevention of Organized Crime Act of 1998, which for the first time in the history of policing incorporated under its Chapter 4 a section related particularly to gang-related crime. It defined criminal gangs, therefore making it easier from a prosecutorial perspective to develop cases based on a pattern of criminal activity or racketeering around particular gangs. It enabled us now to take all the single offenses are committed in the name of the identity of a gang and tackle it in that particular way. This is historically unprecedented. Before, cases were treated individually. That's the one development. I think the other development is through the creation of CPFs and it becoming a statutory obligation on the part of the police through the Police Act to mobilize communities against crime. This developed an additional approach where that required a much more integrated approach from policing to dealing with gangs. It was not only us in the courts and the correctional service anymore, but increasing community participation in opposing bail, in identifying potential witnesses on cases, and breaking the cycle of fear on the Cape Flats. And to a large degree, gaining back the space in the streets that have been occupied by gangs who have used these common spaces, communal spaces, for criminal gain to conduct their activities.
Now, Major General, has this been a success? Because you look at the fact that Western Cape Premier Helen Zille called for the SANDF to come in and assist the police in dealing with the scourge of drug violence and the killing of people in crossfires. Is the community coming out and saying, yes, we want to see these people behind bars, yes, we want to stop the scourge of drugs and violence in the Cape Flats? Is it happening?
Yes, I think I want to talk about two cases, and it ought to give you a perspective of what type of work it takes. The one is a case of 16 members of the Atlantis-based Fancy Boys gang who operated in the area of the Dura Flats in Atlantis for years, since the early 90s for that matter. Their leadership, together with everyone, were taken down under the Organized Crime Act, under the gang-related criminal provisions, and some of them got up to 2 to 3 life sentences. Now, I think one of the significant things about that particular case is that despite what people misbelieve about witnesses not coming forward, over the past 6 to 7 years it took to build that particular case, painstakingly communities were canvassed to act against the gangs, resulting in more people coming forward to testify even on very old cases. So that is the one particular case. Another particular case involves a faction of the 28s who operated in the Bishop Lavis Valhalla Park area. Now, Valhalla Park, there was always a presumption about Valhalla Park being under control of the 28s historically since the 70s. But a gang leader of the 28s, one of them, and his cohorts, 6 of them, were taken down on quite a few cases related to the gang-related criminal provisions of the crime provisions of the Organized Crime Act. Together with the community, we were able to demonstrate that this fear is not, in both those cases, is not that paralyzing. However, the challenge is, if you take down, like the Atlantis case, 16 members of a whole gang, all its levels, from its drug dealers, its pushers, its hitmen, to its leadership, to those who control its assets and its smuggling networks, then you leave a vacuum. And I think that vacuum has already been entered by its opposition, the VG Units gang, for example. So this is not a one-off solution. The approach requires a much more long-range focus and a continuous focus to regain and maintain control over the space that has been gained. At a level of facilities, for example, if you take the Atlantis example, the Duraflats area, for quite a few years since 2005, there was a creche that they intended to open for kids, which became a white elephant because it never opened. It was later transformed into a youth center which never opened and remained a white elephant. The challenge now is, with the vacuum that is created by the fancy boys moving out, is to fill those spaces and bring that community to a phase of normalization where the state and normal functions of service delivery can continue normally, without ambulances needed to be escorted by the police, without children needing to be escorted to schools in the morning in the area, and without the police almost needing to maintain an occupational presence, an occupying presence, a siege presence in the area. Now is the time for other government departments to exploit the space that is created by the removal of the fancy boys and start stabilizing and normalizing that community through bringing back the state in terms of all its services as an organized footprint permanently.
Now, in terms of, we know that today there was another funeral of Prince, who passed away about 2 weeks ago, having been caught in crossfire. What have the police really done in terms of ensuring how they deal with this problem? Can you briefly give us a description, without giving away the work that you do in catching these drug lords?
Okay. A few years ago, as far back as 2010, our provincial commissioner signed an agreement with the national commissioner, actually in 2009 for that matter, to develop a particular strategy around dealing with gang violence and gangsterism in general. This strategy later became known as Operation Combat. And Operation Combat had one distinctive feature from previous approaches to policing. It targeted individual gangs by name. In other words, it took about 15 to 17 gangs, including gangs in prisons, the 28 and the 26 formations and 27 formations, and started identifying all of them and then targeting them there specifically for prosecution. Now, that particular approach involved 4 pillars. The first one was specialized investigation capability, which was created at Province to focus on the POCAR type of investigations under Chapter 4 of the Prevention of Organized Crime, dealing with gang-related offenses. Out of that provincial team, there emerged the need for 17 other teams, specialized investigation capabilities, to be developed at certain key stations. And over the years, we formed those key dedicated investigation teams at stations. The second pillar that we focused on was focused intelligence management. Now, this involved, now that we've identified our key gangs that we are targeting and the individuals, collecting information of value for prosecutorial purposes and also to disrupt their criminal activity and presence. The second dimension of that pillar's work involved regular, what we call climate measuring, to scale the intensity and or decline, for that matter, of the threat as it develops and as we impact on it. The third pillar in particular involved strategic visible policing, which once again targeted the identified gangs and they disrupted their criminal activity through the use of various highly specialized units at provincial level, together with station personnel to augment it. This included drawing on the resources of our tactical response teams for our more medium to high risk operations, our intervention units for particular types of specialized operations, and also our station crime prevention personnel who would be seconded on a monthly basis to the operation to give a local import and local input to the provincial specialized capability of 100 people. So that is what that involved. The final pillar, the fourth pillar, involved targeted community mobilization. In other words, we would identify a gang, let's say the Hard Livings, and we would direct or attempt to organize together with communities, targeting the individuals we would prosecute in bail hearings to assist us with the opposing of bail, as our Bail Act requires the community's feeling to voice to be heard during such times. Targeting them on the street in terms of disrupting their drug activities through street committees, through neighborhood watch patrols, which disrupt business activities at crucial times when a drug outlet or a shebeen would be profitable. So those are some of the activities, targeting the youth whom we identify through our intelligence operations and collection of information, who are being identified as potential recruits, to stem the type of recruitment and get the community involved in trying to assist us in preventing such youth from being recruited. Those are the key four pillars, and that's what we've been doing. Now, we have stabilized to a large degree through this particular approach the old war in Lavendale, the very intense wars we had waging for 2 or 3 years in the Grassy Park region. We have had a stabilizing effect in Atlantis in terms of the Douro Flats areas, but like I said, another gang has moved in and we're focusing on them. And we have had sporadic success for various periods in parts of Marienburg, Elsies River, and other particular areas. But like I said, these gangs exist way back into the 70s, like the 28-26. Their logic for fighting, their reason for existence is in opposition to each other. And they have been entrenched in our communities as criminal empires. And uprooting them, like I said, is a long range. And if that doesn't only depend on law enforcement. I think Bishop Tutu summed it up correctly in an article in the Argus today when he said, you know, we tend often to blame only the police as if that is the solution. We should focus on developing sustainable communities and improving material conditions, as he argued, to such an extent that gangs would not become an alternative form of youth peerage, of youth identifying themselves, or being considered as a way to economic advancement. And I think that is a type of fundamental type of change that policing can't address, and neither can correctional services, especially in the light if you think about the fact that some of the youth we have sentenced, for example, in the Fancy Boys case in Atlantis, one of the youth thanked us because he was going home to get ranks in the 28 gang in prison. So, I mean, what changes that psyche requires more than just policing.
You're watching Your World on SABC News Channel 404, and we're looking at gangs and drugs in the Western Cape. And our guest in the Cape Town studio is Major General Jeremy Veary, Head of Operation Combat in the South African Police Service in the Western Cape. Now, Major General Veary, in terms of the drugs that are predominant in the Western Cape, what drugs are these?
I think our look, cannabis is still a major seller across the board. Mandrax is still traditionally quite a strongly traded drug. Methamphetamines, or TIC as we know it, has become one of those drugs that was able to make the crossover between a cross-section of type of customers. It was marketed to older women as a slimming drug. It was marketed to men as a form of Viagra at a certain age. It was marketed to school kids as a type of thing that would keep you alert and awake if you were studying for long hours. It was marketed to youngsters to socialize as providing quite a lot of energy. So that is one significant thing about that particular drug. It's reached a cross-section of the population for various other reasons, as stated. Mandrax has always remained the background drug. It is a downer, but it still has its established user network, and still has a wide distribution in particular. But I think the most important thing in the recent success Operation Combat and the stations had was around closing down a Mandrax production pipeline. And we seized about 3 machines, one which produces about 6,000 tablets a minute, and another one about 3 times that a particular amount per minute. And closing down those pipelines that high up in the value chain is what is impacting on the availability of Mandrax, for example. TIC, or methamphetamines as they call it, however, is a different story. It does not require that degree of specialized equipment or knowledge to actually cook it up. And that explains its almost wide distribution or wide production base across the Cape Flats. It can be cooked up in the kitchen anywhere, whereas the Mandrax requires a little bit more knowledge and expertise and more specialized equipment to produce.
Major General Jeremy Veary, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.